vu that we get now and again. Has it ever happened to you? I'm sure it has. Anthony Peake is I'm told, a fascinating character. He's just walked into the studio a matter of seconds ago. We're about to find out. He's the author of several books on what happens when we die. Anthony.
Hello.
Good morning to
Good
you.
morning.
Well, what happens, Anthony?
What happens, effectively, one of the suggestion I make is that at the point of death, the brain is flooded by a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And effectively what this is, it's a chemical in the brain. And what glutamate does is it slows down your perception of time. For instance, when you're in a car crash or you're in a highly stressful situation, time seems to slow down. It's very, very popularly recorded. What I suggest is that when time slows down under these circumstances, what happens is, as far as you're concerned, from your perceptions, time literally almost stops. So effectively, in the last second of your life, it could be 70 years. Now, in that 70 years, all your past life memories, you start to relive again in a three-dimensional recreation of your life.
No.
Yeah, correct. And the interesting thing is the neurology works and the science works as well. That's why I spend 380 pages in my first book trying to explain it. But effectively, what I then suggest is that when you're living your life again, what tends to happen is that part of you recognises the fact that you've done this before, and that's a déjà vu. It's as simple as that. It is a recognition of the fact that you've lived this moment before.
So you believe that we live, we die, and we are constantly reborn after we die?
Well, I don't believe. What I do is I've done a lot of research and reading around the subject, and I come to the conclusion that the evidence suggests that this could be a possibility. And it's not after we die, it's before we die, and that's profoundly important. So it's a matter of the fact of what happens before you die.
In the seconds before we die?
In the seconds before you die, yeah. I mean, have you ever had that experience when you're highly stressed or you have an accident or a car crash where time just seems to just expands phenomenally?
Yes.
Yeah, and that is the glutamate.
It happened to me about a year ago.
Right.
I was pulling out of a junction, and I didn't look properly, and I was within about a second of a serious car crash, and I can remember the whole event slowing down. And I actually pulled over to the side of the road. I was trembling because I thought to myself, that's the closest I'll come to death.
Yeah. And it's so it's so regularly recorded, this kind of sensation. Now, you're probably aware of the phenomenon known as near-death experience.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And one of the major areas of near-death experience, there is about 4 or 5 separate factors that are recorded as part of a near-death experience. And the classic one, as far as I'm concerned, and the most important one, is this idea where people say, my life flashed before my eyes. What I suggest, that's in a near-death experience. In a real death experience, it doesn't flash. It's almost like somebody presses the fast-forward button if you're not really going to die. Whereas in a real death situation, what actually happens is you literally go back. It's like Phil Connors in the movie Groundhog Day, only it's a groundhog life.
You say the science supports your theory. This glutamate you talk about, what is that? And has that been measured in our brain?
Yeah, glutamate is what's called a neurotransmitter. And what neurotransmitters are is that all the neurons, the cells in the brain, they don't actually physically touch each other. There's something called a synaptic gap. And what happens is a signal goes down one neuron, and then depending upon the type of signal, it sends a chemical across the gap. Glutamate is one of those chemicals, and the glutamate is the major neurotransmitter in the mammalian brain, but specifically in the temporal lobes of the brain. And what glutamate is known to do is it brings about quite a few interesting mental states. For instance, glutamate is responsible for migraine. It's responsible for bipolar. It's responsible for temporal lobe epilepsy, and it's also considered responsible for schizophrenia. So this it's a very, very interesting chemical.
So when you say that within seconds of being close to death, that your brain is swamped with glutamate.
Correct, yeah. It's called a glutamate flood, is the technical term.
That has been measured?
Yeah, the glutamate flood is a known physiological effect. You know, it is a known physiological effect, the glutamate flood, as is, and what is interesting as well is that the excess glutamate sometimes can trigger temporal lobe seizures. And effectively, it has been recorded that when somebody starts to die, they start to go into a temporal lobe seizure state, and babies are born having a temporal lobe seizure as well, which is really quite interestingly significant as far as I'm concerned.
So can you explain to me then, because you said it too quickly for my primitive intelligence to understand this, that it's like you fast forward. What do you mean by that?
Effectively, what I mean is that the way you perceive time passing slows down. Okay. Now, while that is happening, I don't know if you're aware, but there's been considerable research done on how the brain processes reality and how the brain processes external stimuli. And it has been found that the brain buffers information before it presents it to consciousness. There's a delay of about 0.5 of a second. That's why you jump when you hear a bang, before you've actually consciously become aware of it. Now, the logical conclusion from this is that if the brain buffers information, it is in effect recording it, because in order to hold something back, it has to record it and then present it to consciousness. Now, there were a series of operations done in the 1950s by a guy called Wilder Penfield.
So everything, but so everything happens half a second before we're aware of it.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, there's been certain experiments. There's something called the Phi experiment. There's something called the cutaneous rabbit. I deal with all these things in my books, and they're really quite fascinating. The implications of them are quite phenomenal. There is a new form of science at the moment called consciousness studies, and in consciousness studies, these are the things they're dealing with: how we process reality, how the brain processes it, where it processes
But
it.
if everything happens half a second before we're aware of it, if science was able to expand that, then we'd be able to stop bad things happening to us. We'd be able to stop accidents, wouldn't we?
In effect,
theoretically.
yeah. Theoretically, yes, we would. And that's the areas, that's why I'm working with quite a few people around the world in terms of pushing these ideas forward. As I argued, as I always suggest to people, this is a hypothesis, not even a theory, because the next work I'm planning to do is to really test this out in terms of exactly how the process may work. But there does seem to be considerable evidence that we're on the right path in terms of an alternative way of actually viewing what may happen to consciousness at the point of death.
Do you live this Groundhog Day phenomenon? Do you live the same life over and over again?
Well, and this is where it gets complex, but what I do is I apply something called the many worlds interpretation of particle physics, otherwise known as the many minds, which is the idea that there are literally trillions of you and I having this conversation in multiple universes. Again, sounds totally mad, totally strange, but effectively you pick up any copy of Scientific American or New Scientist, and you'll find that this is a very, very hot topic at the moment. And the idea is...
Spell this out to me, please.
Okay. Gosh, how do you explain the many worlds interpretation? It was suggested by a guy called Hugh Everett III in 1957, and it was a way of explaining certain observed phenomena in subatomic particles. And the idea is that in order to accommodate what these particles do, the only particular answer, there's only two alternatives. Either reality comes into existence by the act of observation by an observer, or the universe splits into many copies of itself. It's something some of the listeners out there might know the concept. It's called Schrödinger's cat, and it was a thought experiment suggested by the philosopher-scientist Erwin Schrödinger. But the idea is that there are literally trillions of copies of us. Now, again, there are scientists such as Max Tegmark and David Deutsch. One's at MIT and I think one was at Cambridge. And both these guys are working on this idea at the moment. They're even working at the present moment in time on computers that will work in alternative universes. This is really hard science. It's just that not many people are aware of it because it is so counterintuitive and so weird that most people don't know. But I'd suggest to anybody, just take yourself into the popular science section of a bookshop and just look at some of these books.
So this is like the film Sliding Doors.
It is exactly like Sliding Doors, or even more accurately, Butterfly Effect. Same kind of concept. The idea is that there are alternative universes, and there's a version of you in each universe, and each version of you will have recorded a version of your life. So in effect, every possible alternative in your life exists out there in the macroverse. It's just how you move through it. And in my second book, I deal with the process of how there is part of you that knows your own future, and I call that being the daemon. And again, I do the neurology of that in my second book.
It cheapens the individual if there are many of me.
No, they're all
if
you.
There are many individuals.
But they're all you. They're all you, and they're all elements of you.
But they're not me if I don't know it's me.
Yes, but just because you don't know it's you, it doesn't mean that you're daemon, for want of a better term. There's an element of your subconscious that is aware of this. And again, funnily enough, I received a letter today from somebody, ironically enough, in Manchester, who has just recently read one of my books. And he's turned around to me and he said, "Do you know, your book has explained everything that has happened to me." And he's a temporal lobe epileptic. And he said, everything you explain, even the higher self, he has a being that shares his life with him, that talks to him all the time. And I have so much evidence from this stuff. You know, it's really fascinating stuff, but it is only a hypothesis, and I keep stressing that. Whether I necessarily believe it, all I'm saying is that read my books and the evidence is put to the reader, and the reader can make their own conclusions.
Do you believe it?
I'd like to believe it, yeah. I'd like to believe that I would have the opportunity to maybe change some of the decisions I've made in my life. I mean, I think it's quite important to be able to allowed to do that.
I deal with politicians all the time, and they say things like, "I'd like to believe it," and "I'd like to do this." Do you believe it?
Yes, I do. The evidence, the evidence and some of the things that have happened to me and some of the things that have been mentioned on my forum and my website by people from around the world very much support the idea.
So does this mean, Anthony, that you never die?
In effect, yes, it does. Well, what it actually means is that you will live many, many lives before you actually do physically die, because...
But you can't die ever in your hypothesis, can you?
You can, because effectively the maths, in terms of the maths, it's something to do with divisibility of an infinity, and there will be a point where an infinity will come to an end. So in which case you can't divide time into smaller and smaller segments of time. There has to be a point where time runs out. When that happens, I suggest that you then move on. But of course, as far as the person watching you die is concerned, you die.
So you're obviously a very intelligent man. How does this affect how you live your life?
It means,
as an ordinary bloke,
it means that I watch the coincidences, I watch the synchronicities that happen, I watch how really unusual things happen to me. And I'm a very, very regular guy. I'm not somebody that is particularly given to anything to do with psychic things or anything like that. But I observe these things happen to me. And people, when they read my book... Well, for example, many years ago, I had a very, very vivid dream. And I dreamt that I was standing on a beach in the south coast of England. And I could see a hurricane or a whirlwind hitting the coastline and actually whipping up caravans and things. Around about 3 or 4 days later, a whirlwind actually hit Selsey Bill in exactly the way in my dream. And it was only about a month later, when I'd gone down to Selsey Bill, that I looked along the coastline and I realised it was the scene I'd actually seen. Now, I know that happened. You know, I know I had that dream. Now, people can say, oh, you know, you're making it up. But I know I didn't.
So that's déjà vu, is it?
No, that's... Well, this is an interesting thing. There's an associate of mine called Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who is in Switzerland, American, lives in Switzerland. He has something called the dream theory of déjà vu. And he, interestingly enough, argues that a déjà vu is a memory of a dream you've had recently, a precognitive dream. Now, again, Art has got his PhD in holographics. He's a scientist, he's a physicist. And yet he's very much convinced that this is how déjà vu works. It's a dream you've had.
The team haven't given me the name of your book in the brief. Maybe you'd like to.
Okay, yeah. I have 2 books out. The first one is called Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When You Die. And the second book, which is a slightly easier read, I have to say, is called The Daemon, A Guide to Extraordinary Secret Self. I'd also suggest if anybody else is interested in my work, I have a very active website, which is anthonypeake.com. That's Anthony with an H, and it's Peake.com.
There are a couple of people who want to talk to you tonight.
Okay.
0500 909 693. We have 5 minutes left. Doug in Edinburgh. Hello, Doug.
How you doing?
What do you think, Doug?
I think the guy.
To be honest with you, I've understood about a quarter of it, but I've nodded my head right the way through the interview.
He's been nodding very well. He's a good nodder.
It's a bit like the light bulb switching on the top of your head here, because I've had this theory for a long, long time that the dreams that we have during life, we're actually storing for the afterlife. And I believe that when we die, we actually relive our dreams again. And basically, my mother died about 2 months ago, and I was at her deathbed, and she was holding my hand tightly, and she slipped away. And it got me thinking about I've always looked at my dreams, and I've always studied my dreams, and they're there for a reason. And I genuinely believe that the dreams that you live during your life, we're all great dreamers, we're all great thinkers, and we get lots of inspirations for our dreams. So when we die, I think that our dreams are part of our afterlife. And there's another aspect to it as well. I think you could go one step further in saying that I think that when you wake up in the afterlife, you've not got your body, but you've got your conscience. But I think that psychics can actually wake you up for your dream world. But I think that we actually create our own dream world during life.
Doug, thank you. Does this mean you cannot believe in God?
No, not at all. Not at all. Effectively, there is an argument that this could be designed. Effectively, if this works in a particular way, there could be elements for design. I am not a religious individual. I consider myself to be an agnostic. But there are, as more and more research I've done, the more I've thought, that there are elements here that suggest some form of design in some way or other. So I'm still working on that one myself, I have to say.
But certainly the Christian faith would suggest that when we die, and we pass on to that afterlife.
Ah, yes, but remember, I'm saying that this happens before you die, and that's the crucial factor, is that it's before you die. You will still physically die at some stage, and then what happens? You move on to whatever you wish to move on to. I mean, it's been an amazing surprise to me how much religious people like this idea. From Buddhists to Sufis to Christians. They're really, and Hindus, because Hindus have very much a similar concept.
Louise is calling from my country, Northern Ireland. Louise, how are you doing?
Hi, Stephen. Hi there.
Go ahead, you can speak
Louise.
to Anthony.
I've just caught the end of your programme, but everything Anthony
Where have you been all night, Louise, for goodness sake?
I'm sorry. Everything Anthony's talking about, I experience all the time. One incident I had a couple of years ago, a good friend of mine had her car stolen, and I said that I phoned her up and I said I had a dream that she was told that the police had told her that the car would be gone. It would be in South Africa by now or somewhere way across the water. And I actually had a dream that the police called at her house and told her that they found the car and that it was right next door to her house. And in actual fact, a couple of days later, that's exactly what happened, and the car was found minus its wheels on the beach just down from her house. And I get these things all the time. When I was 16, I saw what looked like a squirrel to me running across the road. It was just sort of a vision. I was standing at the bus stop. I was 16, and
but Louise,
it
this
got
is
hit
what
by a car. And my dog had just died. That literally at that time, we came home a couple of minutes up the road, and we were just told that our little cocker spaniel, who was chestnut coloured, same colour as the squirrel I thought I'd seen, that exact incident had happened.
This is what psychics would say, Louise.
I know. People think I'm psychic. They sort of get scary. I tell you what, there's a really strange incident I had.
Yeah, but because we've just got 1 minute left, Anthony wants to speak to you.
Can I come in? It's really quite interesting here in that I have a lot of psychics on my forum. And effectively, I would argue that this is an element of psychic ability. It is just a question of how effective you are at channeling those abilities to see the future. Indeed, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is a third book on the work of J.B. Priestley, the playwright who wrote a series of time plays. And in the 1960s, he had a lot of letters that were sent to him by people after a BBC television programme called Monitor. And he had hundreds of letters. And these things were consistent. But my favourite one is somebody as recent, day before yesterday, put something on my forum that they'd had a psychic event whereby they had seen somebody get hit by a bus and killed in the centre of Liverpool. They've placed that on Facebook 3 days before it happened. And I'm still checking this one out. Now, that again is evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that people do see the future.
Thank you for coming in, Anthony.
Thank you.